Hello and welcome to another CS200 mini lecture. We will finish up Chapter 9, Objects and Classes. In this mini lecture, we'll look at Chapter 9.12 through Chapter 9.15. So this gets into some of the more intermediate topics on arrays, array lists, as well as talking about wrappers. We'll talk about some different types of objects. So we have primitive types. So we think about our primitive data types such as integer, character or char, float, and double. Now these are what we call primitive data types because they are what we think of like as atomic units within Java. And then we have others that are reference types. Reference types are, for example, arrays, string, which is an array of characters, as well as different types of objects. Now, the reason why we call them reference types is because they're passed by reference. If you recall from the last chapter, we have the primitive data types are passed by value. In other words, a copy is made and the information has been replicated to the calling method, whereas reference type just passes a reference. And I think you can remember where we pass the address to the heap from the stack, and then the heap had all the elements of the array as well as the array length. You can see that's passed by reference because we're actually referring in the heap where the array begins. So in some cases, we want to treat a primitive data type like an object. Now this may seem bizarre because we've gone through CS160 just fine, and we've been able to do lots of operations on integers, on characters, and so forth. But in some cases, we might want to do things and treat them as objects. So I'm sure you remember where your first time of saying A double equals B, and because one is a string and one is a character, you would have to use the equals as a method. I don't know if you ever ran into that, but if you have, you will have learned that the double equals doesn't work the same way because one is we're assuming that they're copies of values, and the other one, the equals, looks at the value within because if we use the double equals, it looks at the memory address in both locations. So there's a number of different wrappers that are built in. So we call them wrapper classes because they make a integer as a primitive data type look like an object and so forth. So the integer has, of course, there's a way in which we can identify whether we're talking about the wrapper class or whether we're talking about the primitive data type. So the primitive type you can see here are Boolean, long, double, integer, and character, or char. And you can see the reference type always begins with a capital letter and it's spelled out. So character would be the reference type or the wrapper, and the primitive type would be char, and so forth. So we say it's immutable. So we think about like a string object. Because a string object, we can't change the value. You can't just change a character inside of a string, for example. You have to make a copy of that string and make the change to it by slicing up the string. If you've ever had an encounter in which you've had to make changes to, for example, a word in a string, you'll realize it's not as straightforward as you might think. The reason for that is because a string object, like an array, is immutable. And what we mean by immutable is you can't change it. You've got to make a copy of it and maybe overwrite the original, but you can't just change a value inside the string without making a temporary copy. So they have an example here I'm going to skip. Double, of course, you can use that because there's lots of different ways. But remember, the relational operators, like we see in databases, so we have the double equals, like object variable, double equals object variable. The reason why that didn't work, as I just explained, you need to use a method to make the comparison, because otherwise you're just comparing the references. In other words, the memory address for those two and seeing if they're the same. So if you have a primitive, you can compare it with an object. If you compare an object to a constant, so in this case 100, it'll work fine. If you have an object variable, you can compare it as greater than or less than another object variable. And you can also do the same thing with primitives and constants. So equals is a method that allows us to work with wrappers. So in many cases, you might have seen where you have, say, for example, two strings, and you'd have to use the equals. Or you looking at a character, you'd have to use the equals, not the double equals. And then compare to, it will return a 0 if they're equal, a negative number if one is larger than the other, and a positive number if the converse is true. So these are some of the different types of methods that we can use, and we can work with wrappers. Now, in many cases, you may just be a little bit confused. Why am I using a wrapper at all? A wrapper doesn't really do a whole lot of benefit to me because I can do the same thing with the underlying image. Let's take a look at an example here inside of BlueJ. Okay, so here we have a wrapper example. So here what I'm doing is I'm saying integer. Notice it's not int, it's integer with a capital I. So what I'm doing is I'm saying the value 5, I'm going to treat that as an object. So I'm building a wrapper around that integer primitive data type and treating it like an object, and so forth. So I have double and character, and here I'm going to print them out, and this gives me just the value of them. So here, notice I don't have it declared as my, I just say 100. So I'm just changing the value. It's still considered an object. I'm just changing the value. So here's something we might want to do to it. So we're going to convert a string. We're going to convert this 100 to a string. So instead of it being an integer, we're changing its value and its characteristics to make it like a string. Then we can do certain things like look at the length. So we couldn't just look at the length if this was an integer, right? We'd have to do some other kinds of manipulation to see if it's 1 digit, 2 digits, 3 digits, etc. But if we convert it to a string, then we can check the length. Let's compile this, and let's take a look and run it. Okay, so we go back over here to our wrapper example, and we run it, and lo and behold, what we get is 5,599A, which is just, we're printing out the values of those. And then remember we converted my int into 100, and then we converted it to a string, and then we looked at the length, and that gave us 3, which is interesting because think of all the things that you could do if you wanted to look and see how long a particular integer was, but you would be very hard pressed to do this without doing some kind of wrapper class and changing it to an object. So that gives us a feel for what happens inside of a wrapper object. Okay, so we have lots of different ways in which we can make these conversions. Okay, so we have lots of different ways in which we can convert them. and we can also go backwards, right? We can convert them back, and 913 talks about that. They use something called boxing and auto boxing and unboxing. So this is just a fancy way of saying going from primitive data type to the wrapper classes, so making them into objects, and then unboxing is going in the opposite direction. So again, you can say double and then give it a variable name and set it equal to a value. Remember, what this does is it creates a wrapper of type double, which is an object. Okay, so we can do lots of different things with it, as we saw in the last subchapter. So we might want to convert them back to the primitive data type, which we can do that by calling an unboxing. Okay, so here's a couple of operations that allow us to convert a wrapper class object to a primitive type. Int value. So if we have an object that has an integer stored in there, like for example that last one that had 100, this actually gives us the value of that integer. Because remember, it's looked at as an object. Even though to us we know it as 100, the object doesn't refer to it as the integer value unless we give it this kind of method to unbox it, right? So what we're doing is we're taking the integer or the primitive data type back out. Okay, we can do the same thing with doubles and longs, with character and Boolean. ToString, I'm sure you remember having used this, where you take a number and you convert it to a string. And there's lots of different ways to do it. You can parse an integer and get the value of. So this way you can create it actually looks at the value inside some string and gets the value, for example, of an integer. So if you have a string of, say, 2020, it's a string, right? It's just an array of characters. And what we want to do is we want to get the actual value 2020 so we can do some mathematical operation. So we need to do something like value of to do that. And of course, binary string does something similar. So here's a way to convert a decimal number to binary. And again, remember this from a lab. This is just one way to do it. I'm going to skip it for now. I think section 914 is array list. Now, if you're familiar with lists or dictionary inside, well, actually lists inside of Python, this might come as a more comfortable topic for you. So an array list is an ordered list, so ordered is important, of reference type items, and this comes in Java. So this gives us the ability to order different types of items. So we also use element to refer to each of the items. But we have some built-in methods that allow us to do it. So think about a list, okay? Make it a shopping list or some other kind of list, and we want to add an item. So we can't just, because we have a list, we need to add it to the end of the list by using the add method. Get returns it if it actually, we specify a index, and it will tell us which of those items it is, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. Set actually replaces the element. We give it a number, so we say we want to replace the 5th item with this value. So set allows us to do that. And then size tells us how many list elements. So it works like length does in some of the other methods, like using with strings. Okay, so in this example, just as I mentioned earlier, what we'll do is we'll go to BlueJ and we'll take a look at this. So what this program's doing is it's actually using notice what we do here. So we have to import Java util array list. So we have to make sure we do this so Java knows to load that library because it's not a default, not like some of the primitive data types. So we have public class most popular OS. We have a scanner object because we're going to read some information in. And then we build this array list. Notice how we define this, okay? Array list, and then we have these angle bracket string. Operating systems is the name we give it, equals new. Remember what new does. New allocates memory for this object type. New array list, and then string, okay? So notice that string doesn't go in parentheses, it goes in these angle brackets. Then we have an integer, and this is going to be what we read in. So we load a bunch of different operating systems, and these have an order, right? So Windows 10 is the most popular, and Windows 7 the second most, and so on. And so we're going to prompt the user for a number between 1 and 8, and then we're going to retrieve which of those items it is. So get number suffix is how we're going to do it. And then we're going to print that out. So get number suffix, what it does is it creates an array of strings. So what it does is it appends this on the end. Okay, so first, if it's first, then we're going to return the number here, 1 st, and second and third, right? So this allows us to go through and use a list to say if we get the first one, we're gonna put first, second, and third. So it just has a suffix that we can add to it. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. Okay, so most popular OS. Let's go ahead and run it. Okay, so let's just say 3. So the third most is Mac OS X. And notice it's smart enough to put the RD on it. So let's run it again and just put another number. And I'm going to use 4 this time. So you notice the appendix changes based on whether it's 1 through 3 or not. So it's a way in which we can make our output look a lot better, and we're of course using an array list to determine that. Okay. So of course we can do things with loops. So here's one in which we're taking a bunch of numbers, in this case 8 numbers, and we're going to average them. So let's go to BlueJ because BlueJ allows us to see things a lot more clearly. So we're going to go to array list average. Let me open it up and we'll take a look. So of course, again, we need to import array list. Then we have a public class called array list average. We have our main, and notice we have final here. So that is a constant, which we set to 8. That's how many elements we have in our array list. We're going to declare a scanner object to read information in from the user in this case. And now look at our array list definition, okay? So we're going to do double. User numbers equals new array list double, and then parens. So then we have sum value, which again, we're averaging a bunch of numbers. So that's going to have the sum, and then we're going to have the average here. Then I is going to be our counter. Again, instead of declaring it here, we could just write int I. So print line enter 8 numbers, because 8, remember, is our constant for num elements. So then we're going to read in, and this for loop is going to count. Make sure when we get to 8, we're going to stop, because it's going to go from 0 to 7. So remember, when we count, we the user, we count from 1 to 8, but the system is going to count from 0 to 7, right? Because it's going to stop when it gets to 8. So that's why when we do our output, we have to do I plus 1. Because if we didn't, and it says number 0, it just looks ugly. So we have to deal with the rest of the humans who aren't taking CS200 and would be very puzzled why the number starts with 0. So notice we use the add method here. So this is going to add to our array list, which we've given the name usernums. Okay. So now we set the sum value equal to 0. Remember, that's just going to sum the numbers. So once we've got all the numbers, we're going to loop through and we're going to sum them. So we sum them by adding each of those particular elements in the array list, and then we calculate the average by dividing it by the size. Now, could we go to num elements and use that? Sure. But why not use size? Because size is a built-in method for the array list, and then we print it out. So let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. Okay, here, let me clear this first. And now we will run our program. Okay, so notice it says 8 numbers. Let's just put some numbers in here. 3, 2. We can also, because they're doubles, we can put values like this, and it doesn't complain because they're not integers. So you can see here, when we get the output using all these different data types, are different precisions of these doubles, and then we get the average. Of course, we could prompt the user for how many numbers we want, and we would not have a final a number that we've defined in advance. We would just prompt the user, and then we could sum different numbers. Okay, so that's how we use array lists with loops. Now let's talk about classes with array lists. Okay, so here they have a way in which we can do a review. Okay, so this is good. It talks on many of the points that we have addressed in this chapter. So we have a public class review. Remember what the private keyword does. Okay, so this does what? This is a field variable, right? It's not a constructor, because the constructor would have a definition. It would be public void review and parens. Okay, so these are just called field members or field variables. And then we have set rating comment. In this one, we're going to read these values in. So let's go over here, and then we're going to do the gets. Remember, those are getters, so we're going to retrieve information. So notice we pass nothing to them, and we get a value back, which is consistent with what we're trying to do. So if we see this, the only thing it's doing, you can see this whole method can be defined in a single line. I would prefer to see it where you put this on a separate line, just because it's clearer and easier to read. So in the review system, of course, remember we have to import our array list. We import our scanner. This means we're going to be getting information from someone. And then we're going to be reading information in. So we read this information in, and then we type in comments. So let's go to BlueJ and take a look at it. Here's our review system and review. Again, there's an arrow pointing from review system to review. This is done automatically by BlueJ, just to indicate that this particular method is relying and using a class from review. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So again, this is right from our textbook. And you can see here, we're just going to loop around. We're going to have a while statement, and we're going to do it until we get a value of -1. That's going to tell us when we end. And again, we're going to output all the comments when we hit a -1. Okay, so let's run this and let's see how it operates. First of all, let's clear our output screen. And now let's run this method. Okay, type rating comments. Okay. Rating first in the comments. It really sucks. And then say we get another one that says 3. Ah, meh. So. We get another rating of 2. Then I would rather die. And then we get another one, say, a 5. I love it. Okay, so we're going to quit. We're going to do -1. And then if we want to check the rating, we type 2. And we can see that actually it goes and it chooses the value associated with what we entered. So then we can go and look at 3 and 5 or 1. And then to end, we just do -1. Okay, and that ends our program. So what this does is this allows us to loop through, enter information, and see it back. So we can run it again and put in multiple values and see what happens. So first of all, let's clear it. I want to put in 2, not for me, and then another 2, and say, I fell asleep. And a 3, say, could be better. Okay, and -1 to stop this, and then if I retrieve 2, it's going to get both of them. So this is a nice way for us to do searches and to retrieve user data. So array lists have their purposes, and you can see how we can use them with classes. So of course, there's lots of different ways to do it. Here, you can see we've made some modifications to make it better. And I'm not going to go through them for this, but you can see the outputs here. And they give you an average rating, and they give you the same outputs that we got. Okay, so that's just a way to do it. And then with the restaurant class, you can see how many comments they have. They output the information based on different values that they retrieve, and they also give you an average. Okay, so there's lots of different things that you can do. Here is a challenge exercise that you can do and test your knowledge of this. Okay, so hopefully this has given you a good oversight on our nice introduction to objects and classes.